Hello, everyone, and welcome to Quiz and Hers, the podcast where Justin likes to mouth the words that he thinks I should say at the beginning of the
mouthing
episode.
the words.
You are.
No, I'm not. I was just chuckling.
Oh, okay. It looked like he was trying to tell me what to say.
No, you know what to say. Continue.
Well, anyway, for those of you who have never listened before, this is the podcast where we test each other's knowledge and the strength of our relationship.
Emphasis on testing the strength of our relationship today, clearly.
Oh, geez. Not a good start. And maybe I shouldn't brag about winning then.
Yes. Hallie is up 7-2 for those of you who haven't been listening to season 2, and I'm not in a good mood.
But it's okay. He has a chance to get a lot of right questions today.
That's the plan.
All right. So anyway, the way this works for those of you who have never heard this before, there's a quiz master and they ask the other person 6 questions from different categories. The categories are arts and literature, sounds and screens, sports and games, science, times and places, and everything else, which could be literally anything else. It doesn't fit into any of the other categories.
Yep.
And then the other person tries to answer the questions, and then basically we talk a little bit about each answer.
Yep.
Did I leave anything out?
Each game has some theme that all the questions relate to.
Right. So all the questions are related to each other.
In some way.
Correct.
Usually pretty loosely.
Right.
All right, let's do it.
So for today's theme, in honor of the day this podcast is coming out,
Okay.
I call it Remember, Remember.
Because it is coming out on the 5th of November.
Correct.
So are we talking about Guy Fawkes?
No.
Okay.
We're just talking about other things that happened on November 5th.
Ah, very good.
Yeah.
So, things that happened on November 5th other than the obvious.
Correct.
Very nice.
Maybe we'll talk about that another day.
Probably.
But
It wouldn't
not
surprise
today.
me if we got to it, but okay.
That would be too easy at this point.
Yes. All right.
Can't make it that easy.
Cool. Sounds good.
Question 1. Arts and literature.
Okay.
What American writer and philosopher born on November 5th, 1885, is best known for his work The Story of Civilization, which he wrote with his wife Ariel and which received the Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction as well as the Presidential Medal of Freedom?
Jesus.
I felt like there was a lot of information in there.
Yeah, but I don't think I know any of the information you said.
That's
think
why I
have
gave
anything
you
to latch
extra.
on. Yeah, I don't think I have anything to latch onto there.
Also, I promise I'm not going to phone them all in with it just being people born on November 5th. This is the only one.
Okay, yeah. That's a little lazy, isn't it?
It's the only one.
Okay. American writer and philosopher. Born in the 1880s. Story of Civilization. Wow, I do not know this.
I'm surprised.
Alright, I'm gonna do the trivia equivalent of throwing the Hail Mary and say Smith.
No, his last name is not Smith.
Fuck. Alright.
It's Will Durant.
I have never heard that name.
Really?
No.
It's interesting because the Story of Civilization is super popular, and obviously it won the Pulitzer Prize and the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and it's super interesting.
Okay.
All right, ready?
Yeah.
So William James Durant was born in North Adams, Massachusetts, to Joseph Durant and Mary Allard, who had immigrated to the U.S. from Quebec. He went to St. Peter's Preparatory School and then St. Peter's College, which was in Jersey City, New Jersey, and then he began preparing for the priesthood. In 1905, he became interested in philosophy, and when he graduated in 1907, he got a job as a reporter for the New York Evening Journal. Soon after, he began teaching Latin, French, English, and geometry at Seton Hall University. Throwback to the Saints episode when we talked about Elizabeth Ann Seton.
Yep.
And he was also the librarian there, so clearly he was pretty well-rounded in terms of his education. And during this time, he was still in the seminary, but he left in 1911 and then became the principal at, it's called Ferrer Modern School.
Okay.
At the school, he fell in love with his 15-year-old student, whose name was Chaya Kaufman.
Oh, boy.
She went by Ida. He was 26. She was 15. They fell in love and got married. And for some reason that I cannot find any information on, he nicknamed her Ariel. And that's just how she was called for the rest of her life.
Fucking patriarchy, man.
I don't know.
Jesus.
I mean, I hope she liked it, but... Not
Wow.
that it's a bad name, it's just
No.
random.
It's just weird that, like, he gets to just change her name because they're married.
And she already had 2 names because her actual name was Kaya,
Right.
but she went by Ida. Very confusing.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So anyway, he resigned from teaching in 1913 and began lecturing at a Presbyterian church, basically to make money.
Mhm.
But actually, the topics of his lectures became the basis for the story of civilization. A couple of years after this, he started grad school at Columbia University, getting his PhD in philosophy. In 1917, he wrote his first book called Philosophy and the Social Problem. His next book to be published was The Story of Philosophy, which started as a series of educational pamphlets and was republished by Simon & Schuster as a hardcover book in 1926. It actually became a bestseller and made the couple a lot of money, which they actually used to travel the world and get the information to write the story of civilization, which they wrote over the course of 40 years.
40?
40.
40?
Yes.
Jesus.
Yeah. So a little bit more about the story of civilization.
Mm-hmm. So this is the work that he's known for? Like, this is the one that will ever come up in trivia? The Story of Civilization? Okay.
Yeah. And, I mean, he wrote it with her. They wrote most of it together. So their goal with it was to write a quote-unquote biography of civilization that not only included the usual history topics of war and politics, but also art, culture, religion, and philosophy. So basically everything. And they focused it on...
Fuck me, I have heard of this.
I was going to say, like, for such a history buff, you would probably...
We talked about this years ago when I took European history in high school. This was the literally first day of the class. He was like, my teacher said, this is like the approach we're going to take. We're going to talk about everything, not just politics and war. And then he never mentioned it again. So I didn't remember it.
You can't get mad at yourself for not remembering something from the first day of high school or whatever.
I can. Okay. I shouldn't.
No, you shouldn't. So anyway, they focused the series on the previous 2,500 years.
Is that all?
That's it. No big deal. I mean, that's why it took them 40 years to do it.
Yeah.
So there are 11 volumes. The first volume, called Our Oriental Heritage, has 3 books, and they're about the Middle East, India, China, and Japan. The 10th volume, called Rousseau and Revolution, won the Pulitzer Prize for Literature and the Presidential Medal of Freedom awarded by Gerald Ford. The 11th volume, called The Age of Napoleon, was published in 1975. They left behind notes for the 12th and 13th volumes, which would have gone up to 1945, but they never got to finish. The Story of Civilization is now considered the most successful historiographical series ever.
Wow.
Yeah. So during the time...
Wait, you said Gerald Ford gave him the Presidential Medal of Freedom? Mm-hmm. So they must have been like in their 90s at that point, right?
Well, yeah, I'm getting there.
Okay.
So
I'm doing the math in my head, and I'm like, that doesn't compute.
Yeah, they're old.
Okay.
So just as an aside, during the time that they wrote the series, Will Durant also worked on several other pursuits. In 1944, he wrote the Declaration of Interdependence, which aimed to start a movement against racial intolerance. The Declaration was read into the Congressional Record in 1945. So that's pretty ahead of its time.
Yeah, cool.
And the two of them also wrote a dual autobiography. How cute is that? They were really in love.
But they never hosted a podcast together.
I know, so can't beat that. In 1981, Will entered the hospital, and while he was there, Ariel stopped eating and died on October 25th. So that's 1981.
Fuck.
Yeah, and then his kids and grandkids tried to keep the news from him while he was in the hospital, but then he saw it on the news on the TV, and then died 2 weeks later at the age of 96.
Jesus.
So he had a very long life,
wow.
But the end was kind of sad.
Yeah. Well, usually is, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, if he was 96, I realized she must have been 85.
Yeah.
So they both had pretty long lives.
Yeah. Cool.
Yep. Question 2. Sports and games. What game, based on the Landlord's Game created by Elizabeth Meiji to explain the single tax theory, was released by Parker Brothers on November 5th, 1935?
Monopoly.
Correct. I told you you'd do better.
I'm 1 for 2. That's not great so
All right,
far.
well, I started with a tough one.
All right.
Elizabeth Meiji was an American anti-monopolist who created the Landlord's Game to explain Henry George's single tax theory. She patented the game in 1904 and self-published it in 1906 in hopes that it would show people the negatives of concentrating land in private monopolies. In 1932, Charles Todd had his friend Esther Jones and her husband Charles Darrow over to his house and introduced them to the Landlord's Game. And Darrow asked Todd for the written rules and then immediately began distributing the game himself as Monopoly. So he completely stole it.
So wait, who is Charles Todd then? Is he like Maggie's husband or something, or just a friend, or
No, I think he just, like,
he just knew the game
a
from her?
person that knew the game
I see.
because it was just getting passed around. Like, I don't
I
think
see.
it was being mass produced or
I see.
anything.
I see.
I think it was just being passed among friends, and it was all fun and games until
Right.
Darrow completely stole it and changed the name to Monopoly.
Got it.
Yeah. So his version sold really well in 1934, and Parker Brothers bought the rights from Darrow. They also bought Meijei's patent once they realized that there was another version, aka Darrow stole it.
Right.
Yeah. The original version of the game was based on the streets in Atlantic City, New Jersey. The cartoonist F.O. Alexander created the go-to-jail officer Edgar Mallory, Jake the jailbird, and the mascot, who is named Milburn Pennybags.
Fantastic.
Fun fact.
I did not know that.
Yeah. In 1936, Parker Brothers began selling the game outside the U.S. This is very fun. In 1941, the British Secret Intelligence Service had the game manufacturer in the UK create a special version for World War II prisoners of war of the Nazis, in which they hid maps, compasses, real money, and other things they could use to escape.
Ah.
Yeah, and they were given to the POWs by fake charity groups created by the British Secret Service.
That's cool.
Isn't that so cool?
Yeah.
I love that. So Hasbro now owns the game after they bought Parker Brothers in 1991. In 2003, they held a national tournament on a train that traveled from Chicago to Atlantic City. Isn't that cool?
Yeah.
So a little bit about the game. I know most people know a fair amount.
I want to say before you jump into the game,
yeah.
that story you just told is the like ultimate illustration of American capitalism. So this woman developed a game to argue for why unfettered capitalism is bad and leads to, people being oppressed.
Right.
Then someone steals it out from under her and makes millions off of it at her expense.
Yeah, exactly.
Great.
Yep.
Okay.
So, yeah, the irony.
Hmm.
Anyway, the game of Monopoly has 40 spaces with 28 properties, 22 streets, 4 railroads, and 2 utilities. The 4 railroads are B&O Railroad, Pennsylvania Railroad, Reading, and the Short Line.
Uh-huh.
The 2 utilities are Electric Company and Waterworks. I think pretty much everyone knows the basic rules, so I'm not going to get too deep into that. Basically, you want to get properties of the same type or color so you can develop them and then get the other players to pay rent while landing on those spaces. And then players go bankrupt when they can't pay what they owe, and then they're eliminated, and basically you win by not going bankrupt.
Right.
As anyone who's ever played Monopoly knows, the game can last pretty much forever. Edward P. Parker of Parker Brothers even said, "We always felt that 45 minutes was about the right length for the game, but Monopoly could go on for hours." Also, a game was supposed to have a definite end somewhere. In Monopoly, you kept going around and around. End quote. Hasbro said that the longest game ever lasted 70 days.
Oh my god.
I assume not continuously.
Presumably not.
In the rule book, there is actually a set of rules for making the game shorter, and there's also a version with a time limit. There are also a lot of house rules that many people use, like the free parking jackpot rule, where the money from income tax, luxury tax, chance, and community chest goes to the center of the board, and then when a player lands on free parking, they get the money.
Yeah, that's not actually in the rules of the game, right?
It's not.
Yeah.
There are a lot of house rules like that, but did you know these rules actually make the game much longer because people are much less likely to go bankrupt if they keep getting more money.
Right, yeah, if you can just win the lottery every once in a while,
so
it'll prolong the game.
Right, so it makes it much longer. And as you can imagine, there are roughly 1 million themed versions of Monopoly. I know as a kid we had the Pokemon and Looney Tunes versions.
Nice.
But there are also spin-offs of Monopoly that change the game, usually to make it quicker. Some examples are Advanced to Boardwalk, in which the goal is to build the most hotels on the boardwalk, as well as several card games. There was also briefly a Monopoly game show produced by Merv Griffin.
That sounds terrible.
Yes, it does. That's my fun fact.
Nice.
Question 3. Science. On November 5th, 1895, George Selden, a patent lawyer and inventor, got the first patent for what invention for which he was inspired by the internal combustion engine at the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia? That might be the longest question I've ever written.
He was inspired by the internal combustion engine?
Yes.
What's his name?
George Selden.
The car? The automobile?
Is that your final answer?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Huh.
You seem very confused.
No, I figured I would know the name. I don't recognize that name, right? I thought it would have been like one of the names you think of when you think of early pioneers of cars, like Daimler or Ford or something like that. But
Oh yeah, I didn't even get into that. I'm mostly just gonna talk about people that invented the actual motors and engines.
okay,
I figured that could be more sciencey.
okay,
And then I will briefly tell you how each type of engine works, but it's kind of boring, so it's mostly just the history.
okay.
All right. After the idea of the automobile was first conceived, inventors' main goal was to find a reliable portable power unit for it to move. Makes sense?
Yep.
You could say this is still going on today. But anyway, the first inventions were steam-powered vehicles, the first of which was built in 1672 as a toy for the Chinese emperor.
Huh.
Yeah, but it was tiny. And the first one large enough to transport people was a steam-driven tractor invented by Nicolas Joseph Cugnot in 1770, but it wasn't very successful, I think because people in France didn't have much use for tractors. But in Great Britain, Richard Trevithick was running a full-sized vehicle in Cornwall, England by 1801, and it was like running and transporting people around.
Steam-powered.
Yep.
Yeah.
The first automobile patent ever in the U.S. was given to Oliver Evans in 1789. Since this is a science discussion, I'll mention the science of it. Basically, there is steam that is created in a boiler full of water that is then piped into a cylinder which moves a piston. So the steam moves the piston.
Right.
Okay, now back to the history.
Okay.
So progress did not happen quickly for these vehicles because of legislation like the United Kingdom Locomotive Act, which required self-propelled vehicles on public roads to be preceded by a man on foot waving a red flag and blowing a horn.
Amazing.
So maybe if that insane law wasn't created, we'd have flying cars by now because that delayed everything.
Great.
Yeah. In 1828, Anyos Jedlik, a Hungarian inventor, created a small model car powered by an electric motor. In 1834, Thomas Davenport from Vermont created the first American DC electric motor. Between 1832 and 1839, several electric cars were invented independently in Scotland, France, and Germany. Alternating current, or AC motors, work by passing a current through opposing pairs of magnets, which creates a magnetic field that makes the motor spin. DC motors work similarly to AC motors, but the electric charge only flows in one direction, so DC couldn't really be used for larger vehicles.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, electric motors didn't last very long because of the advances that happened with the internal combustion engines. But obviously now we're sort of trying to get back there.
Yeah.
So the way that an internal combustion engine works is that the fuel is mixed with air and then moved into a cylinder. The piston compresses the mixture of fuel and air, and a spark ignites it, which causes the combustion. And the gases that are produced during combustion is what push the piston, and that's what causes it to move.
Right.
So internal combustion engines were invented as early as 1806, when engineers such as François Isaac de Rivaz from Switzerland used gases to create the engine. They mainly used hydrogen-fueled internal combustion engines.
Oh, God.
Yeah. So
That seems dangerous.
Yeah. But then after that, there was a version that was propelled by coal gas.
Mm-hmm.
But in 1870, Austrian inventor Siegfried Marcus became the first person to use gasoline in a liquid-fueled internal combustion engine. Marcus was honored during his lifetime as the inventor of the motor car, but because he was Jewish, the Nazis later ordered for all of his work to be destroyed and his name to be removed from all textbooks so that they could give credit to Carl Benz instead.
Ugh.
Yeah. So basically he was like the person that invented gas for cars, which lasted until today.
Oh my God.
And no one has heard of him.
But I've heard of Benz.
Him.
I've heard of Benz.
Siegfried Marcus.
Siegfried Marcus. Goddamn Nazis.
Yeah, I'm going to remember that name. Anyway. In 1879, American George B. Selden filed for a patent for an internal combustion engine and its use in a four-wheeled automobile. So I think basically the point is that he's the first one to file for a patent for the engine in the car.
Right, a car that runs on an internal combustion engine as opposed to steam or something, and as opposed to just the engine itself.
Right.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. The patent was actually delayed for 16 years because he continued to file amendments to the patent application.
Oh, God.
Yeah. The patent was finally granted on November 5th, 1895. And afterwards, Selden licensed the patent to most automakers in the United States and collected fees from every single car they produced.
Wow.
Yeah. And that's the happy ending.
Good for him. Jeez.
Yeah. Cool story.
Yeah.
All right. Ready for question 4?
Yep. You look puzzled.
I'm just making an executive decision.
Oh, Okay.
I was like, should I switch 4 and 5? But I'm going to stick with it. Okay. Question 4. Times and places. Which anti-slavery and women's rights activist whose name is synonymous with the 19th Amendment was fined $100 for trying to vote on November 5th, 1872?
Susan B. Anthony.
Correct.
Yes.
See, I told you you'd be fine.
Yeah, okay.
All right. So I'm going to talk more about the history of women's suffrage, of which Susan B. Anthony had a huge part, of course. In the early 1800s, there was a lot of opposition to women even speaking in front of groups of men and women at the time. There were the Grimke sisters, who were born to a slave-holding family in South Carolina, and they spoke out against slavery throughout the Northeast, and the Congregational Church published a statement against them for speaking.
Ugh.
However, they ignored everyone's disapproval, and Angelina Grimke was the first woman to speak before a legislative body when she spoke against slavery before the Massachusetts legislature in 1838.
Good for her.
Yeah, Massachusetts legislature. That's hard to say for some reason.
Massachusetts legislature.
I don't know.
Okay.
Anyway, after this, other women began speaking out against slavery and in support of women's rights, including Lucretia Mott, a Quaker minister and abolitionist, Abby Kelly Foster, also a Quaker abolitionist, and Ernestine Rose, a Jewish immigrant from Poland. Lucy Stone became the most famous female speaker and helped reduce the discrimination occurring at the time against women speakers. Before 1848, women's suffrage was not one of the main focuses of the women's rights movement, actually. Many of the women believed that activists should avoid political activity altogether, and a lot of them were Quakers, and their religion actually barred them from participating in politics. So they kind of weren't even focusing on voting at that time. The first women's rights convention, which most people know, was the Seneca Falls Convention in the Finger Lakes region of New York.
Throwback to our very first episode.
Very first episode, yep. 5 women ran the conference, the most famous of whom were Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. When Stanton's husband learned that she wanted to discuss women's suffrage at this convention, he refused to come, and Lucretia Mott also was not thrilled by Stanton's proposal, so even Lucretia Mott was just like, I don't think we should go there.
Like it was too big a topic, like it was too big an ask or something?
Yeah.
Interesting.
So they were very hesitant.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so when Stanton did propose it at the convention, it was the only resolution that was not adopted unanimously by the members, but eventually they did adopt it once Frederick Douglass announced his support. Isn't that cool?
Yeah, wow.
Yeah. In 1850, the first National Women's Rights Convention was held in Worcester, Massachusetts, and they were held every year for the next 10 years until the Civil War began. Stanton became friends with Susan B. Anthony around this time, but Anthony was still mainly focused on abolition. Anyway, I think Anthony probably had the right idea. That does seem like a better priority to get people basic human rights when, as opposed to getting the right to vote. I mean, it's important, but she had to prioritize. So
slavery is worse than not being allowed to vote.
Correct. So that's they were just prioritizing.
All right, yeah.
Yeah. So in 1866, the National Women's Rights Convention voted to change to the American Equal Rights Association and fight for equal rights for all American citizens. At the time, some abolitionist leaders wanted them to postpone their fight for suffrage until African American males got the right to vote first. But Stanton and Anthony refused to back down. There was actually one group of women led by Lucy Stone, who I mentioned earlier, who agreed to let black men achieve suffrage first in order to keep their relationship with the Republican Party and the abolitionists. So they were trying to just keep their ties and not cause any trouble.
Right, okay.
Yeah. But Anthony and Stanton wanted women to achieve suffrage at the same time, and they created a separate women's movement unrelated to the abolition movement. The 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870 and gave black men the right to vote. So that was at that time.
Yep.
So they didn't win.
Yeah.
Essentially. In 1871, the National Women's Suffrage Association encouraged women to try and vote and to file lawsuits if they were stopped. And like I said in the question, Anthony was fined $100 for trying to vote, but she actually never paid it.
Good for her.
Yeah. In 1878, Senator Aaron A. Sargent, who was friends with Anthony, introduced the Women's Suffrage Amendment. It took 40 years for it to become the 19th Amendment, but there were actually no changes to what he originally wrote.
Ugh.
But, bureaucracy, it took forever. The wording of the 19th Amendment is identical to the 15th Amendment, but it just substituted race, color, or previous condition of servitude to sex. So,
Yeah.
And the first election in which women were allowed to vote was the 1920 election. So it did eventually happen. I don't think Anthony was alive to see it, unfortunately. I should double check that. What?
You should double check these things before we're
Well,
recording.
I don't think of these things, and then I get curious, and then I think it's like an interesting thing. Yeah, she died in 1906. That's so upsetting. Whatever, she fought the good fight.
Yeah. There's a lot of morally disappointing history in this game so far.
Sorry.
It's a lot of Nazis and people not being allowed to vote and
That's true. But hey.
And monopolists and capitalism stealing things.
Okay, that was a bad outcome, but this was a good outcome.
Yeah, eventually.
She got it.
Took longer than it ought to have, but
you know, I think she made a huge difference. I
Yeah,
think
absolutely.
without her, it wouldn't have happened that early anyway.
Absolutely, yeah.
So that's not a sad thing.
It's disappointing it took so long, but yeah.
Oh, well, yeah.
Yeah.
Of course. All right. Question 5 is everything else.
Okay.
What software for touchscreen devices based on a modified version of the Linux kernel was unveiled on November 5th, 2007 by Google?
Android.
Yeah. I knew that was kind of easy, but I thought it was an interesting question. That they unveiled it on November 5th.
Mm-hmm.
So, Android Inc. was founded in Palo Alto, California in 2003 by Andy Rubin, Rich Miner, Nick Sears, and Chris White. Their original idea was to use it as an advanced operating system for digital cameras. But then they realized that the camera market wasn't really big enough, so then they decided to market it as a handset operating system instead. This was like before smartphones.
Mm-hmm.
So it's crazy. In the beginning, Rubin had trouble finding investors, but his good friend gave him $10,000 in cash and even refused to take a stake in the company.
Wow.
So he just had a very nice friend. We wouldn't have Android today if not for his nice friend.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Who was it? Do you know?
I don't know his name. He was no.
It was just some guy?
Yeah, it was just
Wow.
some rich guy he was friends with, I guess.
Wow.
Nice guy. Then in 2005, Google acquired Android for over $50 million, and their main employees were hired by Google. Google marketed the platform for mobile devices as a flexible, upgradable system. The early prototype of Google's mobile device looked similar to a BlackBerry with no touchscreen and a QWERTY keyboard. Your favorite kind of phone.
Yes, I hate virtual keyboards.
I know.
So deeply.
You're used to it now.
I still hate it every time I type something that's spelled wrong, or every time autocorrect fucks me. I just become so irrationally mad. I can't stand it.
You really held on as long as you could.
Yeah.
Anyway, after Apple released the iPhone in 2007, Google changed their specifications to support touchscreens as well.
Mm-hmm.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
The first commercially available smartphone that had Android was called the HTC Dream, which was announced in September 2008. In 2013, Google announced a special version of the Samsung Galaxy S4 that had stock Android and would receive new updates more quickly. This was the first phone to be part of the Google Play Edition program, which later included the HTC One and the Moto G Google Play Editions. I'm not even sure what this means, sorry. I think it's saying that they just get updates more quickly and have like the basic Android functions. I don't know. In June 2014, Google announced Android One, which were hardware models to allow companies to create high-quality phones for a lower cost for consumers in developing countries. Unfortunately, the project did not work out that well because of reluctant consumers and manufacturing partners. In 2016, the Pixel and Pixel XL smartphones were the first phones made by Google and replaced the Nexus series. So that's what they have now.
Mm-hmm.
I heard it's pretty good.
Okay.
Besides phones, Google has also developed Android Wear, which they later renamed Wear OS. That's like the glasses and whatever.
Oh, yeah.
WEAR.
Yeah.
They also created Android TV and Android Things, which is for smart devices, like the Internet of Things.
Right.
Recently, they have also developed Android Auto for cars and Daydream, which is a virtual reality platform. There was even a video game console that ran Android called, I don't know how you pronounce it, OUYA? Ouya?
Really?
Yeah.
Never heard of that.
Yeah, and it actually became one of the most successful Kickstarter campaigns ever. It was released in 2013, so I guess it didn't do that well, because I've never even heard of it.
Me neither.
But I saw a picture of it, I don't know.
Huh.
It's weird to me that it was such a big Kickstarter campaign, and yet we've never even heard of it, so I don't know what happened.
Yeah, I mean, that seems like a great idea to run a game console on Android, but I've never heard of this thing ever.
Yeah, me neither.
Wow.
Yeah, I don't know. Anyway, fun fact. Each new Android update since 2008 is named in alphabetical order after a dessert. The first few were called Cupcake, Donut, Eclair, and Froyo. From there it goes gingerbread, ice cream sandwich, jelly bean, Kit Kat, lollipop, marshmallow, nougat, Oreo, and pie, which was just released in August 2018. I feel like pie is kind of lame after all the others.
Yeah.
It's like fun. Jelly bean, Kit Kat, pie. I don't know. I wonder what they're going to do once they get to Z. They're getting there.
Yeah.
Sometimes they'll have them like really quick in a row, so I don't know. I was trying to think of
Zeppeli. Z will be Zeppeli.
No, I was just trying to think of what they'll do next.
They'll probably just change to something else.
Yeah. But it is fun. Like I feel like I don't know of any other like company that does something like that.
Maybe they'll
It's
switch to
fun.
vegetables. Maybe it'll be like asparagus, Brussels sprouts, carrots.
That's so sad after dessert. It's like, how do you step it up once you do dessert? Can't get more fun than that. Zeppeli, that's a good one.
Yeah.
They'll have to.
Yes. It's the only option.
There are zebra cakes.
True. That's true.
Okay, that's all I got.
Okay.
Okay.
Right.
Are you ready for this last question?
I'm ready.
Okay. Sounds and screens. On November 5th, 1988, which band whose last #1 hit was called Rock and Roll Music had the #1 record in the US with a song that was released with the movie Cocktail?
Wow. I don't know. That's a very good question, though.
Thank you. That was the first question I wrote.
It feels like something I should know, and it seems like there's a lot of
information,
like a lot of hints there that I'm just not.
I didn't think you.
Finding.
No offense, I did not think you would get it.
I don't know.
You want to guess?
Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons. I don't know. All right, whatever.
It's the Beach Boys.
Really?
The song is Kokomo.
Ugh.
Justin hates that song.
I do hate that song. Ugh. All right, go on.
Anyway, I have a lot to say about the Beach Boys.
Okay.
This is more interesting than I expected it to be. Pretty interesting. So, Brian Wilson started a band in the late 1950s with his brothers Carl and Dennis, cousin Mike Love, and friend Al Jardine. Is it Jardine? I think it's Jardine.
I think so.
Okay. And they were high school students, and they called themselves the Pendletones. It was a pun on the word Pendleton, which is a type of shirt that they wore in the 50s. They thought they were being clever, you know?
Yeah, okay.
His brother Dennis was the only band member who was actually a surfer, and it was his idea for the group to sing songs about the surfing lifestyle in Southern California. Their first song was called Surfin'. Very creative.
Great, yep.
So, even though their father Murray didn't like the song, he called it, quote, rude and crude. He got his friend, who was a song publisher, Height Morgan, to record the song. After they recorded the demo, they were signed by Herb Newman, who owned Candix Records and Era Records. A young promoter for Era Records suggested that they change their name to the Beach Boys since the Surfers was already taken. Their song Surfin' was a hit mainly on the West Coast and hit 75 on the Billboard Hot 100. Soon after, Jardine left the Beach Boys to go study dentistry. Woo! Go dental school!
Probably would have done better for himself as a member of the Beach Boys.
Well, it's like the opposite of what Roger Taylor did.
Yeah.
Because Roger Taylor left dental school to join Queen.
Yeah. That was the right decision in hindsight.
But you'll see. It all comes back around.
Okay.
So, Jardine was then replaced by David Marks. After they struggled to find a new label, they finally signed a 7-year contract with Capitol Records. Their second single was called Surfin' Safari, and it rose to number 14 on the Billboard Hot 100 and even became popular across the whole country.
Mm-hmm.
Their first album, which was also called Surfin' Safari, was unlike most albums at the time in that it mainly consisted of original songs which were written by Brian, Mike Love, and their friend Gary Usher. In 1963...
Most albums then were like covers of old standards and stuff?
Yeah, like in the 50s.
Yeah, I suppose so.
Yeah, most things were not all original like that.
That's true. Huh.
Yep. So in 1963, the band released Surfin' USA, which was their first top 10 single. I'm sure you've heard of it.
Can't stand it.
Okay. You don't like any of this.
I really don't.
But wait. Their album with the same name reached top 2 on the Billboard charts. Then in 1964, Capitol Records had also picked up the Beatles, so they were no longer as interested in the Beach Boys at the time. In April 1964, Brian wrote his last song about surfing, which was called I Get Around. But it actually became their first single to hit number 1 on the charts, so clearly they were still able to compete with the British invasion groups.
Yeah.
In 1965, Brian decided to stop performing with the group and focus just on songwriting and producing. He wrote the album Pet Sounds, released in 1966, which was supposedly more daring and contemporary. It didn't do great in the US, but it reached number 2 in the UK. Get this. Paul McCartney actually said that God Only Knows from the album was his favorite song of all time.
Wow.
Have you heard it?
No.
It's really good. Listen to it.
Okay.
Yeah, it's called God Only Knows. I'm sure people know it.
Yeah, probably. This is not really my era,
No.
but yeah.
Or your
taste.
trivia category of
No,
choice.
no, it's not. Although I think I did read, when I was reading about Sgt. Pepper for my episode a few weeks back, that Pet Sounds was like a big influence on what the Beatles were doing at that period of time.
Yeah, they were sort of like influencing each other
Yeah.
at the time because Brian was influenced by them as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Brian then began working on their next album, Smile, but it was never released because Brian was taking forever to work on it, and Carl got arrested at the time for refusing to be drafted into the military. So they were kind of falling apart at that time. Their contract with Capitol Records expired in 1969, and they signed with Reprise Records in 1970. In 1971, they released the album Surf's Up. And then in the mid-70s, Brian was doing a lot of drugs and had to have constant supervision by his psychotherapist named Eugene Landy. They mentioned him like 100 times in the Wikipedia article, so maybe it's a useful name to remember.
Okay.
In 1977, the album The Beach Boys' Love You was released. Wilson said it was his favorite album that he'd written, but fans and critics were very divided in their opinions on it. In the early 80s, Dennis also started having drug problems, and the other band members insisted that he leave the band until he got back on track. But unfortunately, he fatally drowned in 1983.
Shit.
Yeah, I think he was probably drowned because he was on so many drugs.
Probably.
Yeah, so that was sad.
Oy.
Yeah. The band spent the next several years touring and recording songs for film soundtracks, and then in 1988 they released the song Kokomo with the soundtrack for the movie Cocktail, and it surprisingly topped the charts and became the band's best-selling single of all time.
Huh.
It's just so interesting because like they didn't really sing songs like that anymore.
Right, yeah.
Since, like the 60s.
Yeah.
And then like they just released it and it became huge.
Huh.
Yeah. So after that, the band stayed together and continued touring. Carl was diagnosed with lung and brain cancer in 1997 and died in 1998.
Jeez.
Yeah, I know. It gets kind of sad. After this, the band broke up, but they all wanted to continue doing their music. Love and Johnston got the license to tour as the Beach Boys. Jardine also began touring with his band, the Beach Boys Family and Friends, but ran into legal issues because he didn't have the license.
You think?
Yeah. Love and Johnston actually had the name Beach Boys.
Yeah.
He did not. And then Brian Wilson also continued to tour regularly with his own band without using the Beach Boys name.
Right.
Which is crazy because
he was the driving force.
The original guy. Yeah.
But he was probably the only one whose name had enough clout in and of itself that he could tour without the Beach Boys name, right?
Oh, yeah. Like, he's
everyone
the only
knows
one
who
I
Brian
know.
Wilson is. Nobody knows who any of the others are.
Right.
You've been talking about them for 10 minutes and I still couldn't name any of them.
I've also heard of Jardine before, but that's it.
Mm-hmm.
So in 2011, Wilson, Love, Jardine, Johnson, and David Marks announced that they would reunite for another album and a 50th anniversary tour. Their song, That's Why God Made the Radio, actually hit number 3 on the U.S. charts. That was in 2011.
50 years. That's crazy.
Yeah, isn't it?
Yeah.
But then after more disagreements, Love and Johnston went off on their own with the Beach Boys name again, and Wilson, Jardine, and Love began touring together separately. I have some other random Beach Boys November 5th facts, just coincidentally for you.
Okay.
It's very weird that they're like, I found 4 different facts about November 5th.
Okay.
So on November 5th, 1970, Brian Wilson lost his balance on stage at a concert, and his right ear was severely damaged from the sound level on the stage. And I think that was part of why he stopped performing with them and just stayed in the background.
I see.
Mm-hmm. On November 5th, 1982, Love, Carl Wilson, and Jardine sent Brian a letter firing him from the Beach Boys until he dealt with his personal issues. And then on November 5th, 2005, Love filed a lawsuit against Brian Wilson for using his likeness to promote his new album.
Oh, jeez.
They kind of just argued a lot, but it's impressive that they all came together in 2011 and still got a song to be number 3 on the U.S. charts.
Yeah, that is impressive.
So it seems like they work well together. They just get mad at each other a lot.
Right, yeah.
They 2 of them wrote autobiographies at the same time, and then they were fighting over who was right. And
it seems like a lot of the best bands have these kinds of internal discord, and the Beach Boys.
Yeah, I mean, it seems hard to be in a group of that many people and get along well for 50 years.
Yeah.
How would that possibly happen? But yeah, I thought that was a fun, interesting story of the Beach Boys.
Very cool.
Yep.
I didn't know much of that at all. I could name Brian Wilson, and I could name Kokomo, and I Get Around, and Surfin' USA. And that's probably everything I could tell you about the Beach Boys prior to this. So.
Well, now you know.
Informative.
Yep.
Well done.
Yep. I think it was interesting.
Yeah.
I try to be interesting, not just informative.
Well, yes.
Hopefully.
That's the idea. Yep. All right. So you are still leading 7-6.
Yep.
But it's much closer than it was, so I'm happy about that.
Right. Well,
All right.
I tried to be nice.
All right, bring us home.
Okay, so we are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Quiz and Hers.
At Quiz and Hers on all platforms, yep.
You can email us at quizandhers@gmail.com.
Yep.
Leave us a review on iTunes. We are on every podcast platform. If there's a platform you like and we're not there, let us know.
Yeah, but I think we've pretty much covered them by now. Yep.
I think so. But just feel free to give us any feedback that you have.
Yep, we'd love to hear from you guys.
Yep. All right. Bye.
All right, bye.
Question.
I'm going to be editing out so many coughs into this episode. Ugh.